Hello everyone and welcome to the Hidden Lives of Writers. My name's Fiona Snyckers and I'm joined by Gail Schimmel.
Hello Fiona.
Gail, can you tell us about your writing week? How's it been going?
Fiona, things have changed in my writing life. Having refound the muse, I'm not letting the muse escape from me, and I have realized the need for strict discipline. I had got lax. I am writing 1,000 words a day.
Wow, that's a lot.
I am not letting myself off the hook. I've got to write those 1,000 words. I have a little tick thing in my paper diary. Yes, I still have a paper diary that I have to tick off my 1,000 words a day. The only leeway I'm allowed is I can set as 5,000 words a week. So I can go, okay, I haven't managed today. That means I'm going to have to work on the weekend.
Right.
And I'm doing it. And it works. It's just a reminder, bum on seat is the only way you get a book written. And I had lost track of that a little bit, but my bum is now firmly in that seat. How about you? How's your bum?
My bum is also firmly in the seat. I just want to say how amazing it is when you do practice that discipline, how the good words come to you, how the inspiration comes to you. We've talked about that before. You know, do you wait for inspiration to strike, or do you practice the discipline and the inspiration comes to you? I think that way has always worked well for both of us.
I think so, yeah. And I know there are other types of writers, but I find it very hard to believe in. You've got to sit down, you've got to write, and that's how it happens.
For most of us, I think that's absolutely true. Because I'm working on 2 manuscripts at the same time, I've kind of seen a difference between the 2. In the one, I come to it each day as a real blank page, like I'm not entirely sure where this is going. And that is very daunting to pick up this thing. It's an unfamiliar world. It's something I don't feel totally confident in, and writing myself into it is quite a chore. Whereas the other manuscript, I for now know exactly where it's going. I'm very comfortable with it. I'm comfortable in that world, and the words just flow so nicely there. So I think there is a benefit in maybe just planning a little bit ahead and knowing at least where the next 500 words are going, even if you don't know everything else.
Yeah, 100%. I agree completely. Fiona, what have you been reading or consuming to help you in that journey?
Well, I've actually been reading a lot of South African fiction lately, and one of them has been Bad Luck Penny by Amy Haydenrick, who we have had on the pod before. And it's a lovely, delightful South African read. It's a genre that I'm particularly fond of, which is the female protagonist who returns either to a childhood home or a childhood holiday home, and returns as an adult. Her life has gone off in a different direction, but very often there's still the old flame there who never left, and there are all kinds of unresolved family issues that she needs to confront again that have maybe been swept under the rug. And I just find that kind of thing always interesting. I'm always drawn to that kind of book. And this one is set in False Bay, near Simonstown. It's very familiar to South Africans, and it's just a very attractive story. I think people should give that one a go.
100%. I enjoyed it thoroughly, enjoyed it so much. And it's interesting that you should talk about those genres that we have a weird like for a particular type of genre. And you don't even really realize that it's a genre until you realize you're always happy when that comes up again. Because I haven't finished it, but I'm reading a book which is like, you know, I never use the words guilty pleasure about any reading. We should be proud of whatever we read, but in a way it's a guilty pleasure. And I love books about an older female protagonist whose idiot husband has left her for an idiot reason, and she makes good. She builds a wonderful life without him. I don't know what it says about me that I love that genre. And I'm reading a book by Erica James, who is always a good, easy read, like not literary at all, but you can count on her for an easy read, called The Ideal Husband, which is firmly set in that genre. Every time something goes wrong for the husband, I'm like, ha!
That'll teach you.
Yeah, you fool, you bought this on yourself. I love it. So I'm having great fun with my reading.
I think I'm going to give that one a go. Well, our guest today is someone whose books really defy genres. One can only call him a literary writer, and we're looking forward to talking to him. Our guest today is Jarred Thompson. Jarred is the author of The Institute for Creative Dying, published by Pan Macmillan. It won the Afritondo Award. He's also the winner of several scholarships and grants for writing. Jarred is a lecturer at the University of Pretoria. Jarred, thank you for your time and welcome.
Thank you for having me on this podcast, Fiona and Gail. It's lovely to be with you both on this chilly Friday morning.
Jarred, we're going to throw you right in the deep end. How has your writing week been?
How's my writing week been? It's been a bit of a slog at the beginning. So I'm working on my last chapter in my PhD, which is on comedy in South Africa and humor. And I'm looking currently at TikTok comedy. So I'm looking at the comics who were nominated this year in the Savannah 2024 Comics Choice Awards. So ones who were nominated for the uplifting digital content. And it's a very new kind of analysis angle that I'm looking at. So it's been a lot of reading and like starting writing and running into blocks and trying to read a bit more to get a bit more background in how do I approach the analysis, especially of like digital short videos, and finding a kind of reading strategy for that. So yeah, that's kind of what I've been negotiating a little bit.
I mean, a PhD in comedy sounds almost like an oxymoron.
Yeah, I know, right?
So how do you get academic about comedy?
Yeah, I came across this one quote, where it's like to study comedy is like dissecting a frog. When you do it, you're going to kill it. You're going to kill the comedy.
Yes.
You're going to lose that, that vitality. But it's been quite interesting to think about like how comedy just relieves us from ourselves or from our kind of attachment to like, with its satire, particularly from like our political views that must be heard, and it kind of pokes fun at the ways that we are different, but also the ways we all are the same and awkward and make mistakes and make errors, and we all just fumbling along. And I like that aspect of looking at comedy and what it can kind of teach us in its subtle ways. Yeah.
Did the South African TikTok comics kind of come to the fore during COVID or after that?
I think because of COVID, I was made more aware of just how the digital space is also a comedic space and a space that, especially South Africa, South Africans use to kind of poke fun at the political, but also just deal with the ludicrous, ridiculous things that get thrown our way, both globally and locally. And I think it kind of stayed in my mind. Especially there was a particular satirist, Coconut Kells, who kind of rose to fame around that time. And her prominence, or even her technique, kind of caught my attention. I was like, I wonder if I can write about this one day. And then when I eventually got into the PhD program, it wasn't like my initial thing to go into comedy, but because the broader project is about happiness, how do we bear, the kind of dislocations of South African life.
How do we bear life?
Yeah, how do we bear it in a kind of positive way? What kind of cultural things do we use to bear it? It led me back to like, oh yeah, I remember I was interested in Coconut Kells. I was interested in the digital comedy space. So I was like, okay, this is the moment to kind of explore that now. Yeah.
Oh, fascinating. It's such an interesting area of study. So, Jarred, your master's was in creative writing, is that correct?
Yeah, I had a master's in creative writing through WITS and then a master's in literary studies through UJ.
And your PhD is in literary studies?
In literary studies, yeah.
Could you see yourself doing a creative writing PhD?
I do want to. I don't know kind of like the momentum I feel after this PhD, where I'll be on the burnout scale, if I need a bit more years in between to just like settle and then get into a PhD. I don't see myself jumping into one immediately, maybe giving some time, but I do see it as kind of like a goal on the horizon that I do want to pursue. Yeah.
So are you a person who's writing a novel at the same time, or you work on your PhD and that gives you enough creative outlet that it satisfies that writing need?
It kind of doesn't, but I always feel that when I am writing academically, like my creative side does feel a bit starved, but I think last year when I had a bit more time, so I was in my second year last year, I kind of then took breaks to write like a short story, work on a bit of poetry. But I think now, because it's really crunch time for me, that I'm putting on myself really is either at the end of this year or at the beginning of next year. So I'm kind of really focusing on the academic writing, which in itself does have a creativity to it, but it's more of a straight-jacketed creativity. There's a kind of logical argument that you have to make sure that you're following. I do feel in myself that I am missing that kind of just playfulness on the page. And I kind of have to remind myself, like, it's there. It's not going to go away. You can just return to it. Don't worry. And I find like reading poetry every now and then, whether it's like in the bath or on a bus, on a train, helps you just keep that little, spark going, that there is this other side that you can
reading poetry in the bath is about the most intellectual thing I've heard of a person doing this week.
No, I love it. I find it so relaxing. I honestly find it so relaxing. A nice hot bubble bath with some water in case for dehydration. And a good poetry book. Yeah.
So when you were writing the Institute for Creative Dying, what did your daily process look like?
A lot of the novel was written during COVID times, so there was a lot of restricted movements. Depending on my energy level, I'd usually start with maybe like some yoga in the morning or just some meditation, maybe. Obviously with a cup of coffee, a very strong cup of coffee. And I would usually the day before, so after finishing a batch of writing, I would usually try and leave myself some kind of guiding points on what's going to be written the next day. I find that kind of relaxes me. There's no pressure to like think up what's next. So I leave kind of bullet points for myself. Okay, these plot points are what I'm going to explore the following day. And I find knowing that ahead of time, I wake up with less anxiety of like, oh my God, the blank page. And that helps a lot. And so after the yoga and coffee, I will then now kind of sit down to explore those bullet points. I find that I like writing more in the morning and then doing my reading, just like wandering mind and reading articles and different research and stuff, things that I think might help my writing for the next day in the afternoon. And then evenings, if I have the gusto, I'll continue reading, but often that doesn't happen and I'll just kind of try to be mindless and watch like a series or things like that, or just give the mind some rest actually. Yeah.
And in a writing day, how do you set a goal for yourself? Do you have a word goal? Do you have a time goal? What do you have?
With this particular book, I definitely had a word goal. I think I started out kind of wanting like 1,000 words a day from Monday to Friday, but that wasn't kind of like a hard goal. Like if I found that or the scene kind of ended, or I hit a bit of a wall and it was maybe 700 words, then that would be enough for me. And I was like, okay, that's enough. Sometimes, the flow is so good that when you kind of do the word count, like, oh, I've written over 1,000 and I haven't felt it. But sometimes there's some days where you really feel the words and
you add an adjective.
You keep on adding and you keep on checking, where am I 1,000? It's like, no, let's stop. Yeah.
Okay, so how does a young person like yourself become fascinated with dying, ways of dying, the process of dying, and just this conceit of creative dying, which it seems does exist out there in the world, not only in your book? How did you come to that?
I think it was a long journey. I think I'm from a very close-knit family, and so kind of watching my parents go through this stage of like kind of relinquishing more control, like, I come into my adulthood and I kind of take on more responsibilities and they kind of meet their limitations, whether it's with technology or whether it's physically, and I have to help out, kind of like noting that kind of transition in life that parents go through. And then seeing like people who had raised me, like my grandmother, for example, also kind of slowly deteriorating, slowly kind of experiencing early onset dementia and losing her memory and things like that. It's an emotional experience, and it's a very intimate and human experience that I found was really touching. But then it's also, because I come from a also quite religious background, I was raised Catholic, death always brings about like questions of what's next, the spiritual realm, where does this consciousness of mine go? And a lot of the times, especially in undergrad, I was kind of like moving away from Catholicism, and I was trying to find a different metaphysical outlook on life. And there was times where I kind of declared myself as like, I'm a staunch atheist, there's only science and things like that. And then I kind of discovered kind of Eastern philosophy and Buddhism, and read about like how Buddhism and different Eastern philosophies think about like reincarnation and death, and this kind of division between like the self and the wider kind of environment, and how Buddhism tries to like work with that or get underneath that and try to like, you could say, deconstruct it in a way. And so kind of going into that and finding that those kind of thoughts and metaphysical systems kind of resonated more with me. It allowed a bit more room for me to be the queer person that I am. That kind of led me into now this issue of death. And the main kind of inspiration for me was a kind of throwaway idea that was put forward by Alan Watts, the philosopher Alan Watts. I was listening to a lot of his audiobooks at the time, and there's this one audiobook where he talks about death and how Buddhism relates to death, and he kind of has this throwaway idea like, oh, what if one day there was like a hospital for delightful dying, and he talks about how in one department we'll have grand rituals to help and to bring the dying into like the kind of nirvana state, or in other sections people might take psychedelics, but in other sections people might have grand parties and invite all their friends. And so he's basically trying to say like, why do we, especially with someone who's dying, we gather around the bed and we don't kind of just talk about it, or the doctors will kind of shy away from telling the family like, no, this person is going to die. And maybe it's changed. I think Alan Watts was talking maybe in the 80s for that audiobook. So maybe it has changed a lot, especially with the palliative care and insights into palliative care that is happening now. But I just found that idea to be so interesting, and then it just all kind of coalesced because I had gone through this kind of spiritual realignment. I had experienced mortality, and watching people close to me going through it, and then me in my own kind of ways, like dealing with like injuries as a tennis player and experiencing the limitations of my own body. So I was interested in change, and how death is that ultimate change, that ultimate kind of threshold. Yeah. That we cross over. And it's also, it was kind of a writing challenge to myself. How do you write about this thing that is everywhere, that is undeniably universal, but that is also just shrouded in mystery. And then it brought up other concepts that I was also interested in. So like death automatically leads to issues of consciousness. Like, what is it then? What is this thing that gives us life and vitality? And how might I represent that thing in words, in language? Yeah.
Can you talk to us a little bit about your journey to publication? So what you did, how you went about it. You're a young writer. You finished your book. What did you do next?
So the journey to publication, I think it started a lot with me just writing a lot of short stories and trying to work on that, and using the short story space as a practice space for things that I was interested in. And then trying to get those published, and then trying to kind of work on my craft, read other essays about craft, attending short courses. I remember once I attended, I think it was the UCT homeschool, summer school. They had a creative writing short course thing. I got onto that. I think Mike Nichols was the facilitator at the time. I got onto that. So finding spaces to practice, spaces to learn from others. And then continuing with like kind of the short story, submitting to competitions. And then once I kind of got the big break, which was the Afritondo Prize, for my short story, the good help is hard to find. That was in the beginning of 2020. that was kind of like, I guess you could say, my big break, because then I felt like I was a bit more recognized. Afritondo then like approached me, asking if I had any novel ideas. And at that time, I mean, for the longest time, even in undergrad, I'd wanted to go into an MFA program or a Masters of Creative Arts program. And after I finished my Masters at UJ, it just seemed like the most opportune time. I didn't want to go straight into the PhD in literary studies. I wanted a space for the creative, for creative writing. And it just seemed to like align, because Afritondo was interested in a novel from me, and I had just joined this program. So I'm like, okay, I'm in this program. This is the novel I'm working with. This is the proposal I've submitted to the program. Are you interested in this novel? And that's when they hopped along onto the project, and through my other short story kind of recognition, I had met Andrea Natchez from Pam Macmillan, and then she was also interested in what I was doing. And yeah, so it's kind of like putting yourself out there, making those connections with the publishers, and then kind of continuing with the writing, with the development of craft. And because I'm a firm believer, like if your craft is good, if your craft is honed and you continue to hone it, the recognition will come. Like you don't need to like just worry about like the social media presence or just putting yourself out there all the time. I'm a firm believer that the craft will speak for itself at the end of the day. Yeah.
You strike me as someone who, when you take on something new, you do it in a very thoughtful, academic, kind of philosophical way, that you go, what can I learn? You seem very open to learning. Would that be accurate? Is that a lifelong thing?
Yeah, I think it is. I grew up in a family of educators. My mom and dad is educator. My mom comes from a long line of educators. I think education has always been front and center, in my family life. I mean, there were times where my brother and I would get up at like 3 a.m, to study throughout the week. And my mom actually started this trend. She's an early riser, so she would get up in the morning, and then she would like kind of suggest to us, oh, it's really nice to study in the morning. You guys should like get up with me at 3. And so we started doing it, and then we actually found that like it worked. Like your mind is oddly fresh in the morning. I don't think I can do it now. I think when you're in your teenage years, you have more energy. Yeah, you have more energy when you're a teen. But I definitely think I am someone who prides flexibility in learning, always kind of exploring different ideas. And not everything is going to stick, not everything is going to resonate. But I'm interested in the lifelong learning process, and seeing an issue from as many sides as possible to get the wider picture of things. Because I do think that one person's perspective is limited. You need as many perspectives as possible on a subject to get the broadest view of a topic.
Yeah, that's interesting, because in the process of doing an MA, you are being supervised, and there's a kind of peer review process, isn't there? You did it through WITS.
Yes, yeah.
So there's sort of putting your work out there and getting peer feedback, getting supervisor feedback, and then you produce this manuscript, and then it also has to be edited. So there are these layers and layers of perspective. Are you very receptive to that kind of input, or do you become defensive of your work ever?
I think I do. I think that the trick is knowing how can I work with this critique? Is this critique leaning into what my intention is? And if my intention is not translating as being read differently, then what is it in my writing that is leading to that, kind of reading that is being thrown at me? I remember there was one, and sometimes it's just an issue of kind of communicating what my knowledge is and what my intention is. There was one issue in the creative writing space where, especially in this novel, the common critique I ran into is like, oh, you're overwriting. it's too poetic, it's too flowery, it's too too complicated. We don't know what's happening. And I had to kind of take a step back and kind of think about, okay, where can I balance kind of like the overwriting with like just plain sparse language that says what is happening, that says what it is. That was one issue I ran into. Another was an issue because one of the characters is HIV positive, and then someone in the writing group was like, oh, but how can an HIV positive person go off medication? How can they still be okay? And then I had to say, well, no. Sometimes you have to push back. It's like, no, it is possible. If you're undetectable, you can go off your meds. It's not a good thing, but it can happen. You can't just go off your meds, and yes, you'll survive for maybe a few years, whatever, until the virus replicates again. But it is possible. So sometimes it's just kind of like knowing something and saying, no, actually, this is what it is. So you have to know where to receive it and where to push back a little bit, and say, actually, no, this is what I'm trying to go for. Yeah.
Very interesting. You had one of those writing experiences that I'm always very jealous of, where you kind of burst onto the scene. You were one of the young writers last year. I mean, you still are. But like last year, you were at all the festivals, you were doing all the things. Talk to us about that experience.
It was quite overwhelming. I didn't expect, that after the writing process, it would like, you'd be traveling with the book for another year, and in all these different spaces. And I returned to Love Books recently for the publication of David Mann's short story collection, Once Removed, and he's also from my creative writing program the same year, and it just sent me back to that first book launch and how nervous I was. I think I had like my outfit planned from the beginning of that week, and I had it spread out on the bed, and I was just so nervous for that day. But it is a kind of thing, like the more you put yourself out there, the less nervous you get. Although the nerves never go away, you are able to kind of just like sit in yourself more comfortably, sit with your work more comfortably, and be okay with mistakes, with not saying everything as, as perfect or as delicate as you can say it, but it's just showing up as authentic as you can be, in the moment. And that's what I kept telling myself, like, all you can be is who you are in the moment. Nothing else is required of you. And I just try to move with that energy a lot, when I go through these different, festivals, and I meet people, and so many people, and you try to remember the names of so many people, and sometimes you just have to just move with authenticity, and just like, we're all humans here, just trying to share our work.
So in this book, the narrative is told from different perspectives, and it opens with basically a second person narration, which is always an unusual and bold choice. And then it moves to these sort of different perspectives. Some of the characters get a first person narration, some get a close third, there's more of a sort of bird's eye view happening. Can you talk us through how you made those decisions from that early on? This is the institute, you come in, there's a dog over there are plants over there, etc., to then inhabiting the consciousness of the different characters in different ways at different times of their stories. Can you talk us through how you made those decisions?
It definitely wasn't something I planned beforehand going in. It's something that emerged through the writing and through receiving feedback. So it was initially just going to be different perspectives, and the third person was kind of conceptualized to be kind of just like the mortician's diary entries, or the mortician's kind of recordings of what she was seeing or encountering with the residents in different sessions with them. And then it was, one of the feedback that I received was like, it was coming off, especially the mortician section, was coming off as very, very preachy, very didactic, very like, oh, don't let death worry you, it's fine. It was coming off a bit too much like that. And
she is a bit like that.
Yeah.
She's quite convinced of her own rightness.
Right. And I think writing from from her perspective, I think I wasn't getting the right tone or the right angle at her. I don't know. And then my supervisor actually suggested, Bronwyn Lawful-Yoon, she suggested just changing the perspective and seeing what might come out of it. And then that second person perspective at the start of the novel was kind of my first attempt at that. And I just like, okay, let me try kind of take the reader on the journey to this house. And it, in a way, I think I was influenced cinematically in the way, like in a kind of cinema intro, the camera would kind of swoop down, you know, from the clouds into the city and go, you know, up the street to the house. And I think I kind of was interested in that kind of movement. I'm like, okay, what if I take the reader through that kind of movement, playing with this perspective. And then when I wrote that section, I was like, oh, okay, I think this could be the start. And it wasn't the first thing I wrote. I think it might have been the 6th or 7th thing that I had written about the novel. I was like, oh, I think this is the start. And then funny enough, the wedding scene at the end was one of the first things I wrote. So the novel also taught me that the writing does not happen kind of sequentially. You will have like bits and pieces and bobs that will eventually fall out, because there are some things that I took out, and then the things that you have kind of on the wayside will be like, oh wait, this kind of piece fits in so perfectly in this one area. And then the third person gave me the kind of distance to write with the Mortician and Mustafa, because I wanted those sections to focus on their relationship. And I think it allowed me to do this kind of back and forth. Like, it wasn't just the one person, it wasn't just Mustafa or Mortician, but it was about their relationship, the back and forth between them. And then with this roving eye that I had started off with at the start, I realized, oh, I wanna carry this kind of wandering eye throughout the novel. And then that kind of almost naturally led to, oh, well then what, because I had noticed in my roving eye, I was focused a lot on nature, a lot on birds and things like that. And then that kind of echoed my own reading in kind of the way Buddhism relates to the environment and my interest in like insects and science. So it just kind of all kind of came together, because I realized that the roving eye enabled me to like really delve deep into like the microscopic, the insect, and then kind of show how that is both similar but also different to the human environment. Because I think the main point that I was trying to get at is how death is layered into everything, the kind of ending and rebirth of everything. And the roving eye then enabled me to get to that point without just talking through the Mortician and not just say, oh, look at this is dying, it's being reborn. So it enabled me to like quieten her a bit, and put her a bit on mute sometimes when she was becoming a bit too annoying of a character. Yeah.
And can you talk to us? It's got the most lovely title, and I'm always interested in how writers get to their titles. Was it your work, the title? Was it something you were helped with? How did you get there?
It was a title from Alan Watts. He says when he kind of suggests a hospital for delightful dying, he then kind of jokingly says, oh, they'll probably call it the Institute for Creative Dying. And then the audience kind of laughs. It's like, oh my God, yes, this is the title of the book. And then that's why it was so important for me to also like put in the acknowledgement like to Alan Watts for the spiritual entertainment. Thank you. Because he gave me the title of the book. Yeah.
And was it from the very beginning?
Yes. From the proposal, okay. I was like, this title is so catchy. I love it. I'm going with this. And it kind of, when I was writing the proposal for it, the whole connotations with institutes, I wanted there to be like different departments and to be very like, kind of like very institutional. But then I kind of was saying, but this is not really like, yes, the connotation of institute kind of leans towards that, but I don't think the house is that. And so how can you imagine like a different kind of institutionalized space that is also not institutionalized? It's kind of formal, informal. Yeah.
You come from an institution that's different sort of institution. The academic institution's an institution that's a different sort of institution.
Yeah. And it's weird. Some of my colleagues at UP, when they first heard the title, they thought it was a campus novel. And I was like, no, actually, no. I don't think I could write a campus novel. I think people would think I'd be writing about them.
A university where everyone's dying inside.
Trying to get the creativity out, but they must publish and perish at all costs.
So the book is a philosophical conceit, but the characters are not just archetypes. They have very highly specific backgrounds and identities, and their backgrounds are very carefully filled out. And issues of race, gender, sexuality, culture, class, they're all highly specific to each character. Were you doing that consciously? Were you trying to sort of get a spread of characters? Were you consciously trying to make them more than just archetypes?
Yeah, I think that was definitely a concern of mine. I've always been like interested in the genre of storytelling that kind of brings strangers together in a different environment and kind of tests their humanity, I guess, with each other. Those stories interest me. And I did want to really make the characters as specific as possible, but also have their kind of life experience kind of be kind of at angles or at odds with each other, like a nun, a convict, people from really different sectors of society, and see what productive tension might happen when you bring these kind of characters together. And so, I mean, there was a time when I felt that there was too many characters to deal with, and I had to like really dedicate time to each one. So I actually got poster paper, A3 posters, and I wrote kind of their names like Diane, Tobias, and I kind of mind mapped what is their life issue, what is their metaphysical problem. That was the question I was asking. I was like, who is he? And I tried to like get down what does he look like? Who is he? How does he speak? Where does he end up? And I did that for each character, and that helped a lot, because I think just writing about it and not having kind of like a rough plan, at least somewhere to refer to, it can get a bit confusing, because you are kind of inventing histories for these people, and you don't want the histories to kind of be intertangled or mixed up or confused and things like that. So that helped a lot. And it was important for me to kind of use the characters' lives to get at different parts of society that I was interested in, whether it's for Tobias, the kind of, he's dealing with masculinity, but also his colored identity, where it's for Diane dealing with losing your faith, for example, becoming a nun and losing that. And it was drawn also from kind of anecdotes and people's stories that I had heard in public and that had interested me and that had always stayed with me. For example, I had a primary school teacher who actually became a nun and then found out that it didn't suit her, and then she kind of like also kind of went into the NGO space, and I found like, oh, that's just an interesting kind of life trajectory. What if I wrote a character that experienced a similar thing like that? So those things were staying with me for each character. And then for Lucas and Daniel, I think Daniel for me was kind of like because I've had people in my family who deal with chronic depression as well, and personal relations who have dealt with chronic depression, and then kind of mixing that with my experience in academia. So yeah, it was just kind of drawing from what are the things that interest me, and how can I use that in a character, but then also let that character's history take those interests in their own direction. Yeah.
And how much of that history made it into the book?
Of my
yeah, so you've done these mind maps, you've really thought out each character. Did you then want to put every detail that you'd thought of into the book, or was it enough for you that you had it as background and as it came, it was fine?
Not everything made it into the book, for sure. I think definitely in terms of space, there was an interest to explore, and I felt like after the book was published, I felt like, oh, maybe some characters got more of a spotlight than others. But then I had to kind of relieve myself and say, no, it's fine. Like, I think you've tried to kind of weave a kind of symphony of characters, and not every part of a character's history is going to end up on the page. I think there was an interest in exploring more of Daniel's history, for example, with his mother, for example. But that wasn't really like the way the narrative was going and the pace of the narrative. It just didn't allow for that time on the page. Yeah.
I actually think that's one of the frustrations of writing a book with a lot of characters, that you have to go, okay, I'm focused on this particular story, not their entire story.
That's the thing, yeah.
It's, interesting.
Your book raises very interesting questions about what kind of privacy the dying are entitled to, because traditionally in the hospice system, you enter it knowing that you will be cared for and at the most vulnerable time in your life. But you will also have certain human dignity and certain rights to privacy stripped from you as you become more and more helpless. And you raise this in the book. Do the dying have a right not to be surveilled? Do they have a right not to be watched and scrutinized? Do they have a right to having their human dignity preserved, and to what extent do they sort of consent every step of the way to what is done to them? Were you very consciously dealing with this? Is it something that interests you?
I will say, no, I haven't been asked that. I don't think it was something that consciously kind of came into my mind as like issues of palliative privacy, you could call it like that, as it is outside in the world. But what I was interested in is the dynamics of institutions like these that take people in, and kind of the issues of power. When you have power over the vulnerable, how can, all good intentions considered, how can that power kind of devolve into something else? And now that you speak about it, it does raise interesting questions for me, because it reminds me of kind of like my grandmother and seeing the kind of scenes where you do have to give up a kind of agency. And I think maybe it was on some unconscious level running through the book, but I didn't want, when not to spoil anything, but when the issue of privacy comes up in the institute, I wanted to make sure that this wasn't just like, oh, look how great this place is. It's just so wonderful to be here. It's so utopian. Because so often utopian spaces have this undercurrent of power, of oppressive power. And I think in a more kind of wider sense, I was interested in like what happens when the vulnerable give up a certain level of agency, and how does like good intentions of like, this is the kind of doctrine I want to pass on, and it must be passed on like this. How does that impact someone who's really trying to do something quite interesting and innovative, but has to always check themselves, for example, on when they might become a demagogue in their own institute, and where they might also become destructive because they're so tied to their own philosophical system and how things should be. Yeah.
It's such an interesting thing, that link between utopia and power, and that idea, can you have a utopia that doesn't have a benign dictator?
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
You must have done a lot of research for this book, because there are different things wrong with different characters, which are not, just part of the layman's knowledge. And also, the psychedelics used, the herbs, the tinctures, different ways of changing, altering one's consciousness, all that kind of thing. It implies a lot of research on your part. Can you talk us through that process?
Yeah, so with each of the kind of chronic illnesses that the residents deal with, I did have to do like some reading, especially in terms of kind of I mean, it sounds quite macabre, but kind of picking the disease that the characters would have, had to kind of be easy for me to write about and understand because I'm not in the medical profession, but also have something to do with the character's life experience. For example, for Tobias and his heavy drinking. Okay, what does drinking produce? Liver sclerosis. Okay, what is liver sclerosis? How, and then looking at, okay, how do I show that textually? What are the symptoms? How do I get a character to talk about his symptoms, in a way that he would talk about it, but that also signifies to the reader, okay, these are the symptoms of liver sclerosis. These are the problems that you deal with. So it is a lot about, okay, this is the disease. What are the symptoms? And in terms of Lucas with the rehabilitation and the kind of physio, I had to kind of like read up, okay, how does a physio kind of go through the rehabilitative process for someone with an injury like that? So there's a scene where he's talking about the physio, and I had to kind of watch videos on like how a person would kind of hold, I guess they kind of helping bars or aid bars and kind of walk through, and how a physio would deal with that. So that was a big part of getting examples from my reading that I could see translate into the story. And then with the insects and that part, that was quite interesting for me to read. A lot of the times, if you want to go back to my writing process, sometimes it would take kind of like a morning to figure out, okay, what example from the insect world is going to be most conducive. I mean, there's a part in the novel where I talk about ladybugs and red scales and ants. And I think it took a better part of the morning just like figuring out, okay, this is how the ants use the ladybugs. Ladybugs eat red scales. What is the narrative kind of arch that I can write, that kind of can communicate this kind of ecosystem?
You really love the insects. Your face lights up every time you talk about them.
No, I think it's just so interesting. I think it just offers just it just changes your perspective on the world. Like you just think like, oh, my life is so important. This is the most, and then an ant sees the world from such a different perspective and doesn't even know you exist. You're just probably this like force of nature just making noise around it. I just find just like the relativity of it, just like it just does something. It just makes you feel like, oh, you know what? I'm just here. I'm just living. It's fine. Like there's so much more life than mine. Yeah. And that it's in a weird way relieving.
Yes. 100%.
Yeah.
100%.
I found it very interesting that not everyone at the Institute for Creative Dying is dying. And this isn't a spoiler because it's clear from very early on in the book, that there are the terminal and there are the chronic. And in many ways, it's an institute to learn how to live better as well as to learn how to die. Why did you make that choice? Why not make them all terminal? Because I came to the book with that expectation that everybody here is going to be close to death, but that wasn't the case at all.
I think it was on my part trying to communicate that like death is not just like that one endpoint, but that things are constantly ending, and it's not just on the physical, but it's also in relationships. Relationships are constantly ending. When I talk about Daniel and Lucas, and this kind of getting to the point where the reader gets the sense that death is constantly with us. It's not just the end point, but it's like a subterranean thing that is constantly happening. Our cells are constantly dying. It's life and death are inextricable. You can't separate them. And that happens on every scale of our human experience. Our worldviews are constantly dying. We constantly have to like let go of loves, of heartbreaks in order to move forward. And a lot of the times the Institute is about kind of teaching a bit of flexibility, or how to let go, or how to like work with attachment in more healthy ways. If I think of Tobias, it also kind of, how do you work with addiction, and also and how does addiction feed into your sense of value, your sense of personhood, and how you value yourself and things like that. I think if I just focused on the terminals, it would have been, my writing maybe would have focused more on just like that end point. But I think the chronics help me to show a bit more of, if you are chronic, you're constantly dealing with this sense of mortality. You constantly, every time you take your pills for your heart medication, or you take your antidepressants, you kind of get the sense that my body itself is not self-sufficient. I need the outside world to keep me alive. And that kind of dependency on the outside world and our innovations, but also just on the outside environment to keep the body alive, was also what I wanted to get at, that the self is not just like the sealed self, but the self is only the self because of others. It's like, I guess you could say it's Ubuntu, but it's this dependency on the outside world that the chronics allow you to see as a reader.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Antoinette watching the blood leave her body and come back into her body clean.
Yeah.
That's very much what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah. And so, like, how does that change, like, your way of relating to other people if you need to go somewhere to clean your blood? You know, you need machines. And I think it does pose questions of, like, now in our technological age, like, where can we now separate ourselves from our tools? I don't think humans have ever been able to separate themselves from tools. We've always used tools in different ways. And I think the human and the tool is something that, like, is like evolving, and it's, in a weird way, we're becoming more intimate with our tools, to the point where people like Elon Musk want to put chips in our brains. You know, our sense of intimacy with technology is becoming more fused. Yeah.
I'm going to move us away from the book, and I'm very interested, and I think listeners will be interested in, Fiona talked at the beginning about scholarships and residency, kind of that kind of thing. How do you go about making that happen in your life?
I think it is a level of kind of aligning yourself on social media with the right pages that put up these advertisements. And in some ways, the algorithm actually does help with this, because once you start liking similar things, following similar pages, and following and getting into the literary space, the writing community, people do share things, and it's kind of just like being a bit disciplined with yourself. When you see an opportunity, save it, put it down in the calendar, say when the deadline is, work towards, if you have an idea in mind, put it down on paper, and really kind of, because I'm someone that works well with deadlines. So if I see like there's a residency and the deadline, I can say, okay, this is the deadline. These are the steps I need to get to the deadline, which is why also I enjoy the thrill of entering short story competitions, because the deadline helps to say, this is the deadline, write something. And even if I don't like make a shortlist or whatever, at least I have something that I've written, and the deadline has helped me write something. But yeah, so it's a lot about using social media like that to get those advertisements and to know. And then once you're in that space, I find that once people get to know you, they will share. They're like, oh, this, I'm applied for this. You should check this out. And those connections help. So it's a lot of like building that network to get into those residencies.
Could you give the listeners some of the people you suggest following, or the institutes you suggest, not the Institute of Creative Dying?
It's I should pull up the one foundation. I think it's the Jakes. I know the one is the National Arts Council, which is cool. There's the Short Sharp Stories. Yes. Mm-hmm. There's the Wits Writing Center, their Facebook page. They always kind of put up advertisements for writing. There's this one based in the Western Cape. It's a foundation.
Jake's Gerwel Foundation.
That's the one.
Yeah.
The Jake's Gerwel one.
I mean, that's a good start. That's a good start.
Yeah.
And like you say, the algorithm then picks up what you're interested in. The
algorithm will pick up, yeah.
Okay, well, Jarred, we always like to ask our guests, you mentioned consuming series and giving your mind a break like that, but what have you been watching or reading or listening to lately that's made an impression on you?
I've recently, well, not recently, but I've started watching a series called Evil. It's in its final season now. It's about a priest and a psychologist and a scientist who kind of go around investigating different so-called paranormal activities. And the nice thing about, I think the series is written quite cleverly, because they never arrive at a final answer. It's always ambiguous. You don't know whether, is this person possessed? Are they just being poisoned because there's like the fertilizer that they are are using for their crops, for example, is poisoning them. Do they have a mental illness? So it always leaves this kind of ambiguity. And for me, it kind of relates to how do we read the social? How do we read what appears as someone, if you see someone on the street, like muttering to themselves? Are they possessed? Do they have a mental illness, or is something else going on? So I think I like that ambiguity. In terms of listening, I'm listening to this audiobook called She's a Haunting by Trang Tran. She's an American Vietnamese writer. It's also interesting because it's about a house in post-colonial Vietnam, and this main character comes to this Victorian house that her father is kind of rebuilding as a hotel, and the house is haunted. And there's this interesting dynamic with food and eating. Like the house says she mustn't eat the food that's being presented to her, and the ghosts have this interesting relationship to food and the things that they eat. And it's a very interesting kind of exploration of haunting. And it's interesting because the family, her father and her younger sister, don't believe that the house is haunted. She decides to create or to haunt the house back. She decides to be the haunting so that they can believe her, hence the title, She is a Haunting. And I found that it's quite a clever kind of plot twist. And then I'm kind of reading a lot about humor, about comedy, and recently, I'm dealing a lot with imitation. So like mimetic comedy. So how like when you copy someone's speech and actions, often we find that funny. And so I'm reading a lot about like, why do we find that funny? What is it about copying someone or like mimicking them in a kind of mocking or parodic sense? Why do we find that funny? What is it about that? And kind of connecting that to what's happening on TikTok, because TikTok is like being described as like an imitation public. Like people imitate, either they lip sync scenes from movies, or they put on like kind of caricatures of other people, or they imitate certain scenes. And so I'm interested in like that, like imitation publics, and especially in the South African space. Yeah, what does it allow us to kind of think about humor and mimicry and mockery and things like that? Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, Jarred, we hope that everybody checks out the Institute for Creative Dying, which is still on the shelves, published by Pan Macmillan. We hope people go and look up your short stories. I'm sure there are some available online. And we're looking forward to what's next from you.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much for your time.
Finish the PhD and get back to the creative writing.
I will. There's a short story collection that I want to get to. The idea is that it's going to explore food in South Africa, cuisine, food cultures, food ways. So that's the next kind of trajectory, and that is there in the pipeline. And I can't wait to get back to it. Yeah.
We also can't wait. Thank you, Jarred.
Thank you, Jarred.
Gail, we were just talking off mic about what interesting people we've had on the podcast in season 4. Just recently, very interesting minds, you were saying.
Yes. I mean, all through this whole experience of doing the podcast, you meet such interesting people and have such interesting conversations. But there's something recently, I've just been amazed by people's brilliance, and Jarred's mind is like, oh my God, like he's so interesting and so clever, and it's all going on behind that quite pretty face. And it's really, he's extraordinary.
He really is. He just looks at the world in an interesting way, which then makes you look at the world in an interesting way too.
Completely. My brain was like firing on all pistons as he spoke, which, because I'm not used to that, was quite distracting. My brain kept going down little rabbit holes of thought.
What in particular did you take from him?
So I've written so many notes because of all the rabbit holes. So I'm going to choose a rabbit hole, and it's something I'm very interested in at the moment, that he talked about the importance of seeing an issue from different sides. And the way he talked about everything, you can hear that he is a person who's open to having his mind changed and seeing an issue from a new perspective and exploring an issue from a new perspective. And it's something that I'm generally very interested in. And I've come to believe that, have I spoken about this on the podcast before, that the greatest sign of intelligence is the ability to change your mind. And I felt that was something Jarred really has. So I was very interested in that openness he has to point of view. What about you, Fiona?
You know what he was saying about how craft will speak for itself, and you don't have to worry about being in the right social media space and doing all the right things to promote your book and getting everything just so. If it's good, it will speak for itself. It will find its audience. It'll find its way. And I think that's something I'm going to have to start trusting, because I'm really not good at navigating the whole social media space and getting all my ducks in a row. And I think that where one should put one's energy is just making sure that the craft is right and that the thing you've produced is good, and then letting it find its audience.
Yeah, I mean, that has to be the first energy. But I do wonder also if it's true, because I do think that there is an element that all the social media and engagement and having a writer persona and all of that plays in it. It's an interesting debate. Should one rely on the brilliance of one's work, in Jarred's case,
Yes.
in Jarred's case, or is there more to it? And I think it's a debate that writers could have for hours.
I think you're right there. And I think that for me, if I have to choose where to put my energy, it's going to have to be in just slogging away at the craft, trying to hone it, trying to get things right, and then just launch it into the world and let it sink or swim.
For the best. Fiona, what are people asking us about this week?
Okay, so we have a question from Joburg. This is Peter in Joburg, who wants to know about when to reveal a twist in a novel. Do you withhold it, or do you let it come at a time when it feels natural in the narrative? And I think this is something we've both had occasion to think about.
It's actually interesting because it's something I am thinking about a lot in my writing at the moment, because I'm writing a very twisty book. And I have these twists, some of which I've known from the beginning, some of which I'm like, oh, okay. And my natural writing is because my books tend to be set up, big twist, maybe another little twist, end, or little twist, big twist, end. And with this book, I've had to teach myself to go, you know what? Give it to them. Give them this reveal, give them this twist, and then see what happens in the writing, and to trust the process that another twist will come along so that I've got something to write towards again. And it's been quite fun. Like saying to myself, so what? You're only on 40,000 words. You're going to give away this twist. And then there's like a fun freedom to it. So I think it depends on the book. That's my feeling. But for me, it's been something very much on my mind. What about you?
Yes, I'm wondering if Peter is writing in that thriller or crime space where the pacing and timing of the reveal is so very important. But I've also learned, if nothing is happening, if you are bored waiting for the twist, then your reader is also going to be bored.
Absolutely.
If you are boring yourself, then you are boring the reader.
Absolutely. And I think that's also a big thing. And if you are going, when am I going to give them the twist? The reader's probably saying, where's this all going? What's going on?
Yes, and getting a bit frustrated there. So I think there is merit in, when you're feeling that pressure building up in the narrative, allow it to happen, allow the reveal to happen, and then trust that you can further complicate it. Yes. That's something you always say, make a situation and complicate it. Yes. I've heard you say it many times. And just trust that there's more there. There's more to come in your story.
100%.
So we are enjoying these questions very much. We hope you'll keep them coming. Get in touch with us on email or DM us on any of the social media platforms. We'd love to hear from you.
You've been listening to another production from Solid Gold Podcasts.